Thank you, everybody, and apologies on behalf of my Northern European colleagues again. Unfortunately, they don't understand how Lebanese time works, so thank you, everybody, for coming, and especially, I think, the students who came, and it's final exam period, and there's much going on. I realize that. And also, we're very happy to have Ambassador Homboy with us from the Embassy of Denmark as well, so thank you as well for joining us. Very happy today to have with you this panel. It's part of the larger inauguration month that the Issam Fares Institute is having this whole month. I think there are flyers, there are brochures for all the different events that are taking place. I think you can pick them up on that side. There's a table outside there. As you can see, there's actually quite a few interesting events that culminate in the official opening on May 29th, I believe it is. This particular event is within a newly developed research project within the international affairs component of the IFI, or the Issam Fares Institute. And essentially it's a project on dealing with the changing regional order and disorder. Clearly, post-Arab Spring, those days are long gone, and now everybody's trying to figure out conceptually, theoretically, and actually what's taking place in this region. None of us may have that much of a clue, but we're all going to be trying to figure it out. And with this in mind, let me also thank a couple of people, everybody at IFI who's put this together, and especially Ria Marasi, who's the senior program coordinator for this program, for this project. So we have today this panel. I'll try to keep the introductions quite short so we can get straight into the presentations. In this order, and this research project we're doing in collaboration or in partnership with the Danish Institute for International Studies, from which our guests are here from, and it'll be perhaps a year or a year and a half worth of a project which begins more or less today or tomorrow, and will hopefully culminate in either a book project or a special issue journal. So we will keep you all posted on the results of our collaboration and research project. So first up, our first presentation will be Professor Helle Malmvig, and again, sorry for all the pronunciations, which I'm sure will not be too good. Professor Malmvig is a senior researcher in foreign policy at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She works on a number of relevant issues for us here, including regional security, securitizations, and identity politics in the Middle East after 2011, and an interesting project as well, which I think she just began, on visual strategies of resistance, counter-conducts in the Syrian uprisings. She's published a number of articles and she has numerous publications, including most recently Power, Identity and Securitization in the Middle East, Regional Order After the Arab Uprisings, 2013, The Arab Uprisings, Regional Implications and International Responses, also 2013, and Ambiguous Endings, Middle East Regional Security in the Wake of Arab Uprisings and the Syrian Civil War, also 2013. Very productive. Our second presentation will be by Professor Morten Valbjørn, and again, I hope this is correct, who is an associate professor of political science at the Department of Political Science and Government at Aarhus University in Denmark. His professional interests include the Middle East international relations, dealing with Middle East, the Islamist movements before and after the Arab uprisings or revolts, and the intelligently titled The Irrelevance, in parenthesis IR, as in international relations, the irrelevance of Middle East and different new Middle East. Professor Morten also has several publications and numerous publications, most recently revisiting theories of Arab politics in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings in 2014, 3 ways of revisiting the post-democratization debate after the Arab uprisings, also 2014, and the 2013 parliamentary elections in Jordan. 3 stories and some general lessons. The third panelist today will be Professor Lars Erslev Andersen, and he's a senior researcher in international security at the Danish Institute for International Studies. He's has written extensively and has several research projects on focusing on the history of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, the relationship between rebellion and terrorism, and US foreign policy or Middle East politics. He's written numerous books and articles on philosophy, terrorism, and the political order, as well as, of course, on the Middle East. And he's working, I think, on a research project entitled The Concepts of Terrorism and Order in International Relations. Also, numerous publications, too many to list, but a couple, Innocence Lost, Islamism and the Battle over Values and World Order, and Piracy in the Gulf of Aden, Reflections on the Concepts of Piracy and Order. So please help me welcome our three panelists today. And I'd like to start with Professor Malmvig, the first presentation. Thank you.
We're good here? Yeah. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction, Karim, and thank you to everyone for being here, despite the horrible weather, which reminds me a bit about the weather we have in Denmark. And also thank you to everyone here at the Institute for giving us this opportunity to present sort of our initial take on Middle East regional order. And I would also like to take this opportunity to say that I'm really excited about the new kind of cooperation we will do together, Karim. And I see this today as a kind of a kick-off event of the cooperation we will have, hopefully for at least a year or more. So, having said that, today I'm going to talk about Middle East regional order. But I have to admit that it's with a certain humbleness that I do this today to you, because, as you know, I'm coming from Europe, from Denmark, and there's a certain irony to me coming to you and telling you how the Middle East looks like. I risk falling prey to what the late Edward Said talked about, Orientalism, so that my talk today will tell you more about my background and theoretical assumptions than it will actually tell you about the Middle East. I hope this will not be the case, but please see this also as an invitation for you to debate and quarrel with me about my assumptions and ideas about the region. So, with that disclaimer, what I'll do is I'll try to give you a picture of what I call a constructivist approach to regional order, and I will add a little touch of what is called the Copenhagen school, since I am from Copenhagen, and Professor Ole Weber, who coined this theory and this term, was my old supervisor, so I'll add a little of that. And also I should perhaps add that today I'll mostly focus on theoretical stuff and less on the empirical side. And this, again, because I'm now joining you in the region, I think perhaps I have more to say on the theoretical side. My argument in this is that if we look at regional order from a realist perspective in the post-2011 environment, a realist would actually say that, well, not much has changed. Actually, it's the same as always. We have the 5 big powers in the region. It's Saudi Arabia, it's Egypt, it's Israel, it's Turkey, and then, ever declining Egypt. And they are engaging in alliance making and power balancing, and this is the same as before 2011. I would quarrel with that argument and say that in order to understand the changes in Middle East regional order after 2011, we need a kind of different conceptualization, both of power, not in a materialistic sense as the realists would do, but a power conceptualization that's open to the forces of ideas, ideologies, and identity. And also we need theories which can tackle the very close intertwining of regional and domestic forces in the region. And so I'll try in this relatively short presentation to go through 3 main themes. The first being the change I see in what I call the normative power, normative soft power changes. Second, in the rise of identity politics and how to study that through securitization theory. and then I'll end up with what we could say is a continuation or continuity, namely the predominance still of regime security consideration and the permeability of the Arab state or the weakness of the territorial Arab state. So, moving to the next. Yes. So, normative power. And this is the idea which was originally coined by Michael Barnett, I think in the late 90s, right, Mon? The idea that Arab politics is governed also by certain norms. There's certain ideas and norms that you need to relate to as a state leader or political actor. And some of these norms that have been really strong for decades is relations with the West, relations to Israel, and the Palestinian issue. And I would argue that before 2011, especially in the period from 2003 until 2011, these norms were still quite strong, and they were very effectively used by Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. They could very effectively tap into these norms and claim themselves to be champions of these issues. In addition to that, they often also claimed a certain kind of a popular legitimacy or connection with the people. And I think what we're seeing in the post-2011 environment is, on one hand, that we have these actors having much more difficulty tapping into these norms and in a legitimate way making themselves champions of these norms. This especially because of the whole Syrian crisis. But I think what we perhaps also see is that we are beginning to see a kind of change in the normative structure, so that issues such as Palestine, Israel, and the West simply plays a lesser role. And I know Karim, he doesn't agree with me on this, but so we can debate this. And this is in part a result of the uprisings as well. So what do we see instead? I think very much we are in a kind of revolutionary moment, not only internally in states, but also on a regional level. So there's a kind of contestation over at least three things, as I see it. What is to be the legitimate relationship between ruler and ruled? What is the kind of relation that religion is to play in politics, and in which form? And then there, of course, the whole sectarian issue. And there are some authors, also in the West, that claim that this Sunni-Shia division is now the main line of conflict, or fault line in the region, and that it's beginning to take over the Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian issue, as the main conflict in the region, both in terms of its capacity to mobilize people, but also in terms of its potentiality of driving conflicts. And I think this is debatable. And I think we should be careful when studying the rise of what some authors call identity politics, which often is a kind of nice way to say sectarian conflict. And roughly put, we can say that you can have sort of three perspectives or three takes on this. And one take, which is very dominant with especially Western journalists, and I think it's because it makes such an easy way to analyze conflicts in the region. This is just to see the Sunni-Shia cleavages as a kind of primordial conflict, like kind of Asian conflict going back hundreds of years and being driven by ancient hatred by two very clearly defined communities. And this is, of course, the way that sometimes Syria is analyzed in the Western press. And I think, and I'm sure most of you would agree with me on this, that this is a very problematic way to analyze what is going on in the region and in Syria. And so what academics often would do instead of this primordial account is that they instead analyze the rise of sectarian identities also on a regional level. They do that from what I call an instrumentalist approach. So what many academics do is that they try to look at the power behind the use of a sectarian discourse. And so they look to how regional powers, how Iran, how Saudi Arabia and others are using this sectarian card, both to delegitimize others, political actors, and to gain support at home. And I think that this is very crucial compared to the primordial account. But I still think that the instrumentalists lack something in their understanding of what's going on. And so what I'm writing here on my overhead is that I think that this instrumentalist account can't really explain why suddenly this discourse is so effective right now in the region. What is, to me, like really surprising is that in places such as Egypt or Morocco, we suddenly have this sectarian discourse, and we hardly have any Shiites in these two communities. So what drives this? I think there's also a risk with the instrumentalist approach that they simply don't take the identity question seriously enough. So it becomes a kind of, like in the old Marxist days, so the sectarian identity becomes a kind of false consciousness that you can just sort of take away. And in that sense, I think perhaps also if you only use like an instrumentalist account, then it becomes also more difficult to really propose solutions to different political crises in the region, because you don't take the fears of certain groups seriously enough. You only see the regional power behind. And so my proposal is that we can perhaps use securitization theory to bridge some of the elements of these two approaches. So I would argue that securitization theory would be able both to take identity seriously, to see how identities, sectarian identities, are constructed by discourses and practices, and also, and perhaps most importantly, to see how sectarian identities are securitized. And so, from this perspective, one would argue that what is problematic here is not so much the identities, but the very fact that some political actors are securitizing other identities, pointing them out as threats, as security threats, and by pointing them out as security threats, thereby also legitimizing that extraordinary measures can be used. This whole kind of fearful logic. And I think we see this not only in terms of sectarian identities in the region, but I think perhaps also in terms of different political groups. I'm thinking especially about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that has been pointed out by the authorities, both in places as Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, also been securitized, being pointed out as terrorists that we need to be afraid of. And I think this, or at least I hope that a securitization approach can look into these dynamics. So my last point is on so what kind of continuity do we see? And I think that it's clear that there is a continuity in terms of regime security logic still being very predominant in the region. And this is, of course, quite visible in terms of the whole thing with the Muslim Brotherhood that I just mentioned, also in the whole Saudi Qatari conflict over the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Jazeera, etc. That this has much to do about regime survival and regime considerations, much more than sort of territorial national state considerations. So when we are to explain foreign policy behavior in the Middle East, I think we have to look for this dynamic first. And this is a continuation. It's been like this for decades, of course. So at the same time as we see Arab states being relatively weak in a territorial sense, and this is what Leanders once called the permeability of the Arab state, by which he meant that the borders of Arab states are like porous, they are open, so ideas and people, ideologies, conflicts can travel quite freely between the states. And we saw this you could say, in a positive way in terms of when the uprising started, with a kind of positive demonstration effect. But of course, this very much also works in negative ways, and we see this very clearly, of course, that you live this every day in Lebanon, close to Syria, that intrastate conflicts are so easily regionalized here. And it works both ways. So an internal conflict easily becomes regionalized, and then it plays back into this regionalization, then enhances the internal strife. And I think here what we see, again, this is a continuation of decades of policies, that when we have these internal strifes with regional actors intervening, etc., this also makes it much easier for authoritarian states or semi-authoritarian states to legitimize that they're once again using repressive measures, and that they need to use security measures, and that they need to be aware, especially aware of certain communities and certain populations, unfortunately. So, to conclude, I'll just highlight just 2 points. I think one is that we, as researchers and analysts of the region, really have to look at how key regional and domestic actors right now are securitizing identities, and how these fears of the others also are playing in and becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. We've really seen that over the last 2 to 3 years. And then my last point, I had a very good talk with Karim yesterday, and we agreed that perhaps on the more positive side, the region also seems to have gained a certain kind of autonomy in relation to outside powers. There's not, the overlay from outside powers is not as visible as before. They simply play a less important role. And this, of course, also means that the contestations and the conflict lines are now much more, or primarily regionally based. So on that note, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Helle. And I'd like to invite Professor Morten to the presentation.
Yeah. Yes. Close. Okay. Thank you so much for coming here to this event, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me. I will start by a few remarks. My first remarks is about myself. As you have heard already, I've been stuttering. I've been stuttering for the last 40-something years. I'm going to study for the next 15 minutes as well. I have learned to live with it. I hope you can live with it as well. I always start to tell people, partly because to make it open, but also to that my experience is that sometimes I stutter a bit less when I tell people that I'm stuttering. So now we are testing if you are having the same impact on me as other people sometimes have. So the original title of my talk was Revisiting 4 Narratives about a Regional Order in a New Middle East. When and actually I have a paper on that topic, but I quickly realized that I wouldn't have time going through 4 different narratives before and after. So I narrowed it down, only focusing on one narrative, and then I would pay a bit more attention to what kind of narrative it is. It is what one can call a historical analogy. So my title for my talk is On Going Back to the 50s, or 3 ways of using historical analogies when discussing regional politics after the Arab uprisings. And what I'm going to do is I will make a short, some small remarks, comments on what is a historical analogy and what can they be used for, providing 3 different answers to that question. Then I will go on to show how historical analogies have been extremely popular when it comes to the Arab uprisings. And then in the end, I will look at a particular historical analogy, the one saying, well, this is the 50s once again. And I will provide 3 different kinds of perspectives on that claim. And this is only my early thoughts, so I'm very interested to comment and so on from you. But historical analogies as such, one way of describing what is a historical analogies is made by Hong, saying that it signifies an inference that if 2 or more events separated in time agree in one respect, then they may also agree in other. So in a way, it is a kind of a comparative method. And it is used both by policymakers but also in academia, and it is used for different purposes. One reason to use historical analogies is as a tool to make sense of the world, to make the unknown intelligible, by saying something we don't know what is, but if it is like something we know. So it is an analytical tool, or it may be helpful for policy guidance. Another way of using historical analogies is for justification, advocacy for a certain policy where you have already decided on that policy, but you have to get it legitimized. And the classic example is, of course, the Munich analogy, and how appeasement will lead to conflict, tragedy, and so on and so forth. Recall, for instance, how Blair and Bush was fond of saying how Saddam was Hitler, and we could not repeat the mistakes of the past by an appeasement strategy towards Saddam, because then we will end up in the same situation as with Hitler. Then, against this background, there's long debate about the uses, but also the misuses of historical analogies, about whether they at all can be used, and if they can be used, how can they be used. And that brings me, and what I'm interested in here today is how they can be useful, not whether, but how. And it depends upon what are you using historical analogies for? What are they supposed to do? There I will divide it into 3 different kinds of perspectives, suggestions of the use of historical analogies, inspired by an article by Kornprost. What he calls, Kornprost, a positivist perspective. The historical analogies are used to describe, explain, and predict the future and the present. It's based on an assumption that we have a clear past and a clear present and future, and that the past is going to be repeated in the future. A classic example of that would be the famous article by Mersheimer, Back to the Future, where he claimed that Europe after the Cold War would be like the interwar period in Europe. So it would just be a replay of the past. Then you have the post-structuralist perspective, where the historical analogies are used in different way. It is used to deconstruct, to challenge dominant ways of making the world intelligible, by showing how it is quite arbitrary which kind of historical analogy you're using, that you could use all other kinds. And in that way, it opens space for a creative imagination of imagining different kinds of futures. And then you have what Kornprost called the pragmatic perspective, where you are using analogies, new analogies to help make the unknown more intelligible by producing useful knowledge. And the idea here is that analogies should be used to spark our imagination and put new light on overlooked aspects of the present. But it is not so that we have a clear past, a truth, but only a working truth. And there's no claim that the past is identical to the present. It is more thought about as a tool. Okay, historical analogies and the Arab uprisings. It is often so when we have some events which are unexpected, completely surprising, dramatic changes, there's a search for tools. How do we understand this new unknown thing? And one of the most popular tools there, of course, is historical analogies, by saying this is like something else. That has, of course, also been the case for the Arab uprisings, where a few of us really saw it come, and it is certainly an example of a dramatic change in Arab politics. So we have plenty of examples of how the Arab uprising is like 1989, the democratic revolution in Eastern Europe. No, it is like it is the new 1979, the Islamic revolution in Iran. No, it is 1848, the European revolution. No, it is the youth revolution of 1968. No, it is the Indonesian democratic revolution in a Muslim majority country in 1998. No, it is like the pacted transition in Brazil, where you had a military rule and a successful democratic transition. No, it is like the 1880s, the Arab awakening we are seeing again. No, it is 1989, but it is not the European 1989, but the Arab 1989. Think about Tunisia 1989. We had the Yasmin revolution, which produced nothing. In Jordan, we also had uprising and call for change and so on and so forth, and it produced nothing except for social reforms. And then we also have the idea about this is like the 50s. So this idea about the 50s has in particular there's been a growing attention during the last one or two years about this is making analogies to the 50s, to Arab politics in the 50s. There's been a lot of references to an Arab Cold War, a new Arab Cold War, to the Nasser playbook, how the future of the US-Egyptian relationship is in the past, the continuity of Nasserism, the Arab Cold War revisited, the struggle for Syria, return to the past, return of Arab nationalism, and so on and so forth. So there is this interest in the 50s. This is somehow like the 50s, it is often claimed. But it is useful, as I said, that historical analogies can be used for different purposes. So what I'm going to do now is try to use these three different kind of analytical perspectives on historical analogies to examine this historical analogy to the 50s. And the first I will use is the positivist perspective, where actually Mersheimer called his article Back to the Future, and of course it was because at that time there was a very famous movie called Back to the Future. But actually what he should have called the article, I will then use it now instead, was Forward to the Past, because actually it is the past which comes, which reappear today or in the future. And the notion here is that the past then in this account is that the 50s was marked by an Arab sound chamber, as Paul Noble once said, that what happens in one part of the Arab world resonates in other parts of the world, partly because of the new media. The new media of that time was the radio, South al-Arab. We had an Arab public sphere, we had Arab nationalism, and so on and so forth. And here the argument would be, this is like today, that what happens in one part of the Arab world resonates in the other part of the Arab world. We had the Tunisami, as some said, that it's a tsunami which started in Tunis and then it spread to the rest of the world, but it did not spread to Iran, for instance. We have the importance of new media. Today it is not radio, but Al Jazeera instead. You had an Arab public sphere. In the early days of the Arab uprising, there was a lot of talk about a new Arabism and so on and so forth. You had also in the 50s the Arab Cold War, as Kerr coined it in his book. It was an intense rivalry between two camps, and it had some distinct features. It was not a military rivalry, but a rivalry via local proxies, and it was about mobilizing domestic constituencies in other countries. You had the importance of identity politics and simple power. Palestine, for instance, played a very important role, and you had a complex interplay between domestic and regional politics in weak and permeable states. Then the argument goes, this is like today. We have a divided Middle East in two camps, a pro and anti-Syria camp. You have a rivalry which is not about military, but is done by proxies, local proxies. Identity politics plays an important role, and you have a complex interplay between regional and domestic politics. Okay. Then you have, what about the global regional dimension? Back then in the 50s, external great powers did also play a role, but they were not the main drivers. You had a Cold War dimension in the sense that the Soviet supported the radicals, the US supported the conservatives. Egypt tried to play the superpowers against each other to get as much support from both of them. Well, then the argument goes, this is like today, external powers plays a role, but they're not the main drivers. Russia support Syria to today, US support Saudi, Jordan, and so on and so forth. Egypt tries once again to use Russia, US, and to play them against each other. Patrick Seale, the late Patrick Seale, had his famous book about the struggle for Syria. And the struggle for Syria, at that time, Syria was an arena for other regional powers' rivalry. Like today, that after Patrick Seale later on came with his famous book, The Struggle for the Middle East, where Syria had went from being an arena to become a player, but now you can say Syria is once again an arena for regional powers. You had the Arab revolutions in terms of back then in the 50s, highly mobilized publics demanding social justice in sometimes resulting in the fall of regimes. Like today, we have had highly mobilized publics demanding social justice, and we had also seen example of regimes falling. We had a cult of personality back in the 50s with Nasser. Some argues that Sisi is the new Nasser, and so on and so forth. You had back in the 50s military coup, military power. That is exactly what we are having today. What did it? We had promises about democratic change and so on and so forth. It resulted in authoritarian regimes. The Muslim Brotherhood had a honeymoon period with the Egyptian military from 52 to 54, but then it was cracked down, there was repression, and there was violence. Part of the Muslim Brotherhood became violent. So that narrative would be, this is a replay of the past. Or is it? Because you can then also start arguing that the Arab public sphere is being fragmented. The Arab frame is very much challenged nowadays by a sectarian frame. And what we're seeing in the different Arab countries are very different. As for the Arab Cold War, yeah, but non-Arab players plays a much more crucial role today than compared to before. Iran, Turkey, Egypt and Saudi today are in the same camp. Palestine does not play the same role today as it did before. Ideology is not about Arab nationalism as much today, maybe more about Islamism, if at all. Identity is not as much Arab identity than about Shia and Sunni. There is a Cold War dimension maybe, but we are certainly not in the Cold War any longer, and Soviet does not exist. And as for the struggle for Syria, the Syrian regime is a completely different, much stronger Syrian regime we have today compared to the time of the 50s. And as for the authoritarianism of the past, you had a so-called authoritarian bargain in the sense that some kind of social justice was offered at the expense of political rights. There are no signs of that kind of authoritarian bargain today, and it's hard to say that Sisi and Nasser are identical. Sisi has no charisma, I would argue. He has no ideological vision. And in the sense he has any vision, it's about status quo and neoliberal reforms, contrary to Nasser, which had a revolutionary socialist vision. And the Muslim Brotherhood today is very different compared to the 50s. The Islam scene is very different, and we also have the Al-Qaeda context. So now it could be tempting to kick out the 50s narrative based on this positivist perspective. But as I said, there are other perspectives where you're using this kind of an analogy. The post-structuralist narrative would instead go on saying that we can use the 50s narrative to challenge some of the other narratives and show how they're quite arbitrary. It is 79, 89, so on and so forth. Well, it could also be the 50s. So we can challenge the certainty about with which the positivists are using their narratives. It can also be used to highlight what is kept silent in other narratives to appear compelling, and it can be used to be exploring who is using which narrative and for what purpose, actually. The Iran 1979 narrative, for instance, was sometimes used to legitimize the support to the Mubarak regime, because without Mubarak, the Islamists are coming. Or the Iranian used the 1979 narrative saying this is the Arab Islamist revolution like we had ours. Finally, another way of using this 50s narrative is from the pragmatic perspective, using it to spark our imagination as being an ingredient of our reasoning and to cast new light or maybe overlooked aspect of our politics today. And here I would say the 50s analogy can be used in three ways. One way, it can be used as a tool for a more nuanced understanding of continuity and change. But Helle, the late Helle, back in 2002, in response to the debate about 9/11, said there are two predictable and nearly always mistaken responses to any great international upheaval. One is to say everything has changed, the other is to say nothing has changed. Both of these are wrong, he argued. We should instead look at dimensions of continuity in dramatic changes and the subtle changes in the seemingly continuity. And here the 50s analogy could be used, on the one hand, to counter those who are claiming we are seeing a completely new Middle East, while there are also lots of dimensions of continuity. But it can also be used to highlight actually what has changed. So that's one way of using this 50s perspective. Another way of using the 50s perspective would be to study actually what went on, what was going on in the 50s. Maybe it can draw our attention to some issues, dimensions of which deserve attention in our study of present era politics. And here, the idea is not that the past is just a replay of the past, that we get the answers by studying the past, but maybe we can use the past to pose new kind of questions. And here, for instance, by looking at the 50s, we will become aware of what are the sources of power. It may not only be material power, ideational power, symbols and so on may also be important, and also whether you have access to proxies and so on and so forth. For instance, how come that Israel, who is so powerful in military, materialistic terms, it's quite difficult for Israel to project power in the Arab world compared to tiny Qatar? Well, we do not get really long if you only have a narrow materialistic approach to power. Also, 50s can sharpen our attention about the implications of a weak and permeable state and how that often produces, as Helle also talked about, a complex intertwinement between regional and domestic politics. If we go back to the 50s, we will also become aware of that the fact that you have a common identity does not that necessarily lead to cooperation or rivalry. While back in the 50s and 60s, we had Ba'athists and Ba'athists in rivalry with each other, Nazaris and Ba'athists in rivalry with each other, like we today have Sunni Qatar, Sunni Saudi in rivalry with each other. Great powers may play a role, but is it so that the great powers are just using the regional powers, or is it rather so that the tail wagged the dog, as we also saw sometimes in the 50s, 60s? What are the implications of mass mobilization and repoliticization without strong state institutions? Democratization, or is it chaos? The 50s, 60s, it was chaos and authoritarianism. We could learn something about the role of tri-state media, military in politics, and also finally, repression. Will it necessarily lead to violence? If we look at the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s, 60s, it's quite interesting to see it's quite mixed, because there was the Qutb branch which became violent, but actually the major branch of the Muslim Brotherhood turned quietist instead. So my last slide then would be, against this background, it could be useful to study what actually happened in the 50s, but it can also be useful to study the studies of what happened in the 50s, to look for analytical approaches, theories, debates, tools, and so on. Of course, Patrick Seals, The Struggle for Syria could be interesting to revisit. Malcolm Kerr's The Arab Cold War, but also, for instance, Binder had an interesting review essay in 1967 about the tragedy of Syria, which was a harsh critique of Seal and Kerr. Maybe it could also be interesting to reread that. Binder has a famous article on the importance of looking at regional politics at the regional level. Maybe that could also be interesting today. Barnett's famous book on dialogue in Arab politics, where you find a last section about the 50s and 60s. Could it be possible to use his constructivist account on Arabism and translate it as a tool to understand the dynamics of sectarianism today? And finally, Huntington could also be interesting to read about how mass mobilization without institution often produce chaos. So, against this background, I would say historical analogies such as to the 50s, they can be useful, but it depends upon how we're using them, so we should be careful in how we're using historical analogies. Thanks.
Thank you, Morten. I'd like to call on Professor Andersen to give the final presentation. Thank you.
I will move my stuff.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a very big pleasure for me to be in Beirut. And it's very nice to be here in this discussion. I appreciate it very much. One thing I was thinking about listening to the former presentations was the concept of uprising. Because we tend to always focus, when we're talking about consequences of Arab uprising, Arab Spring, and so on and so forth, to look at it as an exclusively Middle Eastern phenomenon. But the funny thing is, or the interesting thing maybe, is that at the same time we saw the uprising in the Middle East, we have seen uprising in the worldwide, so to say. Wall Street group, we see now in Ukraine, we see in Southern Europe, in Spain, Athens, and Time magazine actually made the man of the year, or the person of the year, sorry, the people who made the uprising. So maybe to study this phenomenon, we maybe should look for some more globally changes in the in a way, and not so much looking for the background exclusively in the Middle Eastern or Arab arena. I don't know. It was only a thought. It was nothing I have been thinking about before. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is not the background, not the explanations for the Arab uprising, but the consequences, as far as I see them. And as my basic or my priority in looking at the Middle East is the Persian Gulf. This is my focus. And now I'm doing a project together with a Chinese colleague about U.S.-Chinese rivalry in the Persian Gulf area. And I think China was very involved in the Persian Gulf before the Arab uprising, but certainly the Arab uprising gave them even further opportunity to invest and to engage itself in that part of the Arab world. So that's what we are going to explore a little bit. But let me see some of the consequences and how the Arab Gulf state reacted to them. First of all, the Arab uprising, of course, were not welcomed in the Arab Peninsula, not at all. They do not want these kind of forced reform processes or democratization processes They want to keep them out. And therefore, of course, they didn't like the West, especially the United States, to endorse them and support them. So it was a break in an alliance that were built up during the Bush. Now the ambassador is escaping. Maybe because he only liked theory. The alliance was broken between the United States, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the Arab Gulf state. It was built up after the Bush government discovered that it was not so easy to spread democracy and freedom through wars. And then they had to reconsider their Middle Eastern strategy, and they did that in 2006. They fired Rumsfeld and they engaged Gates, and they built up a new alliance with the purpose of keeping Iran out and the Islamists down. This alliance were broken down as a consequence of the Arab Spring. Israel were not happy. Saudi Arabia was not happy, and this was the situation. So when people were celebrating the Arab Spring with good reasons, many others were very, very worried that this would open up for not a new Middle East, but a deconstruction of the old Middle East. And exactly that is what happened as far as I see it. What is the, of course, Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf states, they also looked at the attitude of Barack Obama as a kind of betrayal of a good ally. Because after all, Mubarak, he supported and was a really, really loyal and fine ally to the United States for a generation. So why give him the knife in the back? They were not happy with that. Anyway, what is the purpose of the regime in the Arab Gulf state? What do they want? How do they see themselves? How do they see the region? I think it's very, very, very easy to make an answer, and it can be said that the answer is regime conservation or regime stability. The only raison d'être is to keep up their own regimes. And that's why they do not like what they are seeing going around in the region. How did how was that affected from the Arab Spring? Yeah, first of all, we saw some kind of inspiration taking place for people in Saudi Arabia. We saw some uprisings around in Saudi Arabia, and we saw that Saudi Arabia reacted very, very harshly on that. We saw that the mess in Yemen became even more messy. The three conflicts that we did know about, the separation movement in the south, the civil war in the north, and the involvement of Al-Qaeda were supplemented by one more conflict, namely a new group of liberals that wanted change. We saw the developments in Bahrain and the Saudi engagement there. We saw the situation in Iraq, and now today we know, I think we did know also 3 years ago, but it's obvious today that this is very, very unstable. And at the last point is, of course, the civil war ongoing in Syria. The role of the United States, as far as it is seen from Saudi Arabia and from the Arab Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia. Well, as far as I see, the United States, they missed containing Iran. Today, they make the point that Iran is an even bigger threat into the Arab Middle East than before. They didn't make an effort enough to solve the to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as you see and can read in the papers today, that there will be no solution, there will be no Palestinian state, there will be no U.S. Success in that perspective or in that conflict. The United States did what they shouldn't do if they would be a good ally to Saudi Arabia. They embraced the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood have been like Iran one side, then the Muslim Brotherhood on the other side have been the created enemy for Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in trying to avoid what they could call a reform or democratization process. So we do need to fight to establish the Muslim Brotherhood as an enemy in order to avoid and in order to tackle our own opposition. This is the development we have seen since the military coup in Egypt, and even more so for the last year. So, in a way, the Middle East was divided very much between states that were touched by the Arab uprising, like in northern Africa or like in Egypt, in Syria, and so on and so forth. And then the GCC countries, except for Bahrain, which avoided inviting this phenomena inside their house. And that you could say in a way, and especially during the visit of Barack Obama to Saudi Arabia here recently, you could say that it has created a rift between the former allies of the Arab Gulf states and the United States. And that could lead partly to a kind of isolation of the GCC states and in the area. We could also look upon it in another perspective, saying that so far Saudi Arabia have some success in their resistance to the Arab uprisings. They succeeded to control it in Bahrain. It's not very nice, but they succeeded. They have succeeded to control it in their own backyard. They can look at Syria and they can see, okay, we have different perspectives, we have different priorities, but after all, our priorities is to get rid of Assad. Well, we share that with a lot of others, but the basic reasons for us being in Syria is not this perspective, is to keep Iran out of influence in that area. So when it comes to, in a way, this is succeeded to avoid the uprising taking place there, and instead we have a nasty civil war. In Egypt, in United States and the European Union, we were not happy by the developments that led to the coup, but that's exactly what they wanted in Saudi Arabia, and they are already willing to pay for it and to support it. And they are on the same page concerning the Muslim Brotherhood. As far as they are banned in Egypt, they are banned in the Arab Peninsula, at least in Saudi Arabia, and they are put on list for being terrorist organizations. So, in one perspective, it seems that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they were left on the in the back when this uprisings took place. In another perspective, you can see that they actually consolidated their own regime power. And maybe this also could lead to an opening up of the area or the region to other new partners in regime not in regime and security partners, namely China, India, and other groups. So, to conclude and to point out some few perspectives, I would say that the politics of the Arab Gulf states is very simple put in, as regime conservation. They would often use, as it's pointed out many times, foreign threats as a way to control domestic opposition. They have two big concerns now. One, as Greg Gorse also puts it in some of his perspectives. One is Syria, but it's basically about Iran. And second, it's Egypt, but it's basically about non-democracy. So this is the politics that we see from the Arab East. Yes. I think, from as far as I see it, I cannot say that we are looking on a development of a new Middle East and all these things, but I think it is fair to say that we are looking on an Middle Eastern old order that is being deconstructing all the times for our eyes. And I think that we should not I'll put it other way. I think we should be very interested in interpreting the role of the United States in this very process, because as it's the experience is that the Obama government, they have been very hesitant. They have been very hesitant to engage themselves into this. I mean, they have a more loose grip, and I think the consequences of a superpower losing its grip on a region, of course, will have consequences. We saw that in when the now I'm using an historical analogy. And I hope I do it in the right way. I would label it a pragmatic way. So that should be good, I think. But when the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we saw a lot of new dynamics and processes developing in, of course, Eastern Europe. New states came up, conflict that were kept down, flourished, and so on and so forth. And I also tend to see that the United States downgrading of its activities in the Arab Middle East at the same time opens up for new dynamics that we are seeing developing from our eyes now. So thank you.
Thank you very much for three very interesting presentations. Helle on bringing up the theories of securitization, and calling for, thinking about the increasing regional autonomy in this changing, shifting order. Morten for, of course, talking about the historical analogies, the different types, and using this question of the 1950s period and calling maybe for that it's useful to study what was studied in that period as a way to maybe put on this analogy. And as of course we're talking about the politics of the Gulf area and its regime consolidation, and talking more about how the Middle East order is being deconstructed rather than perhaps constructed or reconstructed at the moment, at least. So with that, we have a little time for discussion, some questions. Sometime we have maybe 20 minutes or so.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the autonomy of politics in the theories that you've proposed, and I'm coming from actually two comments that I was struck by. One was the comment that there is maybe an increasing, I think you had mentioned an autonomy of the region from international actors. And the other was the opening comment from Lars, which was that, there were other events around the world, and of course, not just in Europe and the United States, but in Africa, in Thailand, and all across the global south as well. So the question I have is that if you approach the Arab uprisings with the theory that has the autonomy of politics, it ends up with a rather suffocating view of these uprisings as about authoritarian regimes. Whereas if you also look at, for instance, the economic changes around the planet and how these were as much uprisings against, the denial of bread as the fight for dignity, it might actually take you away from the suffocation of Middle Eastern studies, where there's, I think, too much emphasis on authoritarianism as the main analytical framework to understand the region.
We will collect a couple of...
I'd like to follow on from that. And it seems to me that the problem with most of these presentations is that you've started from ideas of order, legitimacy. The regimes here were always what Huntington would have called praetorian, savagely repressive. And if there was any order, it was a semblance of order because these regimes were keeping down large numbers of people by repressive means. And it was simply that because of struggles within the regimes, the rising economic crisis, struggles over bread, that these flowed over into the Arab Spring, into the Arab uprisings. So the problem is not to go back to kind of writers of the 1950s like Binder or Huntington. It's to find a better analysis of the historical process, not the order which exists here. And this process is one of integration into a capitalist system dominated by the West with a very unstable state system because it's entirely artificial in the Fertile Crescent. And this should be the way forward. So it's not simply just giving up the suffocating embrace of Middle Eastern studies, but the even more suffocating embrace of American-type political science, which we need here, and international relations, even if it's constructivist.
Questions maybe you could address?
Actually, I agree very much to the point about not having a too narrow understanding of politics, or that there has been too much attention for the last 20 years, actually, in the study of Arab politics to partly a very narrow understanding of either in 90s, what I call the democracy 90s, where there was a tendency to look for what we wanted to find, democracy. Well, then at the end of the 90s, we didn't find it. Okay, then the theoretical turn shifted a bit. Now we wanted to explain authoritarianism. And then we used 10 years explaining why the authoritarian regimes were so resilient. Then we had the 2011 uprisings, and then we had a debate, well, is it now we are going to have democratization? But again, we have a very narrow understanding about what politics is about, actually. So actually, what I'm calling for is actually to have a broader understanding of what is politics, and politics is also about economic, social, and so on, all those kind of issues. And actually, I think the 50s is a brilliant place to start looking, because if you look at political science, in the 50s, at that time, you had a much broader interest in understanding development in a very broad sense, and in an assistance in how social, economic, political, cultural phenomena actually, as always, were important to pay attention to. There was not that kind of compartmentalization of the study of politics, where politics and economics and the social and so on were different spheres, but very much in interest in looking at the interplay between those. And if you look at Huntington, he argued that those kind of dimensions play together, but it might not be so that all good things go together. So he didn't have this kind of naive modernization theory that progress in economic terms also would pay out in political and so on terms. So actually, I think there's a lot of A place to look would be to the 1950s, where you had a much broader understanding of what politics is about, and also an attention not only to the state regime level, but also strong attention to the societal level.
Thanks. Yeah. Perhaps since I think this touches on some of the points I tried to make in my presentation as well. On the autonomy of regions, that's to be understood in the sense of autonomy from outside powers in a political sense, for sure. So you are both very right in pointing out that there's no sort of economic perspective. It's completely absent from my analysis. And this is, of course, in part, I think, something to do simply with disciplinary boundaries. I'm not an economist. And if I were an economist, I'm sure I've given you a completely different presentation. So being both a political scientist, but also with a sort of Middle East background, this is, of course, what I draw on. So this will be inevitably the sort of narrow perspective, my lens through which to understand what goes on in the region. And here I should perhaps also point out that when we are using the term regional order, that's not to be understood as order as something that's orderly in contrast to something that's unruly or as a kind of repressive order. This is, I would say, a way to open up to understand international politics of the Middle East as more than just alliances and power balancing. So this is what the term or the concept or idea of order is meant to do. Having said that if our aim is to understand the Arab uprisings, and I think but it's not our aim, it's our aim to understand what goes on at the regional level in the region. But should we have tried to explain the Arab uprisings, of course the economy plays a major role. So you're very right in pointing that out. But I would stress this was not the aim, but it was actually to understand what goes on at the regional level and try to see that as more than just a power balancing and more than materialist power. And in that sense, you could say, of course, and that would link to the economy debate, that when seeing power as something more than material capabilities, this also means that the economy is not given that kind of primacy that you have in I would say, both actually in neoliberal approaches and in post-Marxist approaches.
Just some short speculation on the concept of order. For me, order is not a normative concept. An order can be a very bad order. When I talk about the old Middle Eastern order, I'm talking about the post-colonial order that was created after the First World War and the borders drawn there by the former great powers. Of course, everybody knows here in this room that it was not a good order. It is exactly this order that we are seeing being changed, as far as I see it. And that's what I'm referring to. This order was not legitimate, it was not fair ruled, it was not, but it was stable. And you can say if stability is what you want, and that was what Robert Gates wanted when he established a new alliance after the democratic adventures of George W. Bush. Well, then it worked for a period. That order is not working anymore. What we will see coming out of this mess, I don't know, but that is the only speculation on the concept of order. It's not a normative concept.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions to ask. One is to really understand what is going to happen here in the region, this post-2011 uprisings, identities, relationship, power place and so on. Should we not really also understand why is it that the uprisings have not taken place until 2010, 2011? Why is it that the Arab world, what political scientists call Arab exceptionalism compared to other regions of the world? Why has this been the case from post-independence, post-Second World War, up until 2010? There must have been some general factors that have made the region order, the regime stay as it has been staying until the breakout of the Tunisian revolution. Now, things, in fact, things had been moving. And I mean, there has been growing, I'm an economist, but that's why I also read political science. There have been growing inequalities. There have been growing degrees of unemployment. There has been growing corruption. There has been also a desire for freedom with neighborhood effects in the world. I mean, there has been this mix of policy and economics that ultimately led to the uprisings of 2011. My question to you in particular is about is it a surprise? I mean, I'm a political scientist at New York University. I think I may misspell his name, Chirosky, at New York University, who postulated, who postulated that in fact, triggers, these things happen sometimes at random. There's a randomness as to why things take the time they take. For example, the Tunisian Bouazizi thing is very much perhaps a random effect. But there had been growing, forces that had been pushing for change that ultimately, at one point, a random effect made it blow up, and it had its consequences later on. Thank you.
Hi. I have a question for Mr. Anderson. You said that the US is losing grip over the region, but if we're assuming that there's a reconstruction of the old order, shouldn't we also assume that there's a reconstruction of the security structure that the US has imposed? And the break between the US and the regional powers, it was at a very ideological moment in the Obama administration, when he was doing democracy reform and all of that, but he has moved back to a more realist approach. So can we see maybe a move towards progressive engagement and not a complete loss of grip?
Hi. I'd like to reflect on this idea of randomness, especially in terms of order. So when we think about randomness, we're kind of giving agency to individuals. We're giving agency to Arabs, to people like Bouazizi. And so if we consider that order is trying to basically be able to react and prevent such randomness, to destabilize these regime structures. And I'd also like to quote my grandmother. Once I was up at her house in the mountain, I was reading something about the uprising, and she's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, I'm reading about the uprisings." And she said, "The uprisings are because kids can't pay their bills on their new iPhones." And I was like, oh. Basically, what she was trying to tell me was that kids, they're exposed to all these, ideas of democracy, ideas of freedom, ideas of, we should be able to eat, we should be able to survive, but we can't. And so I'm trying to basically say, well, to what extent does this type of politico-economic structure actually affect the regional order? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's always a challenge for me to be clear. When I'm saying United States is losing grip, it may be exaggerated, because of course United States has a severe interest in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, and in Israel, and in the oil, and in the stability of the world market for oil, and all these things, and they won't give it up. But they did take another approach to the Middle Eastern affairs. I think the Obama administration has been very keen on transforming the security politics from using big wars to using dirty wars instead. And this change also influenced the role of the superpower in the Middle East, because they are not, Obama government, not that interested in involving itself in wars like they did maybe before or threatened to do before. This is another attitude, and that gives another dynamic in the security area and the security regime. But for instance, taking the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, a lot of people are talking about this severe crisis. But I tend to agree with Gregory Gorse when he says, well, there has been crisis before. This is not a divorce. They will still have common interests that they will try to fulfill, but they will do it in another mode, in another manner. And this is, I think, what the Obama government tried to do in the Middle East is an exercise that has been more challenging than they, I think, thought of from the start, and that it hasn't found its own shape, so to say, now. And we will have to wait and see how they will adjust. But it means that new dynamics are having opportunity to develop, as well as other actors, like, for instance, China, is more invited in. I hope I answered something.
As for the question about whether it would be premature to skip the question about how come that the regime had been authoritarian for so long time. I completely agree that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This actually, I think there's a richness in the literature of the last 10 years about authoritarian resilience, which is still relevant, both to understand what is going on right now. They're offering plenty of tools, but also to understand what went on before. But we should also revisit our assumption that we thought we had got what happened, but maybe we didn't get the whole picture. So I think it's really important still to understand what happened before. As for the question about prediction, I think that it's useful to make a number of distinctions. If I predict what happens if I do like this, then I will not have my telephone any longer, and I will be quite sure that I'm right. So there are some things we can predict, and most of the time it actually works. But in the social science, we are in a field which is very complex. And it is very hard to predict because there are so many factors. And it is not only in the social science. For instance, seismology has also given up the whole idea about precise prediction about when an earthquake is going to take place. The only aim they have today is make what you would call a pattern prediction rather than point prediction, that there will be an earthquake in a certain area, but you can't say exactly when. And it is more likely it happens somewhere than elsewhere, but that is about how far as you can get. And then it becomes even more complex in the social sciences because we are dealing with human beings, and those who are making theories, they are also acting, and in that way changing the object we are studying. So if we are making predictions, maybe we change the reality. So maybe our prediction was right, but then we changed the reality due to our predictions. And then finally, misperception is a very important concept also here. For instance, a colleague of mine, as Fred Volby, argues that if you look at the revolution in Libya, it has a lot to do with misperception among those rebels. They actually thought they were stronger than they actually were, and the West did also think that the rebels were stronger than they actually were. So that was a reason also why the West acted as they did. So there's it is not only pure facts, but it's also perceptions and misperceptions. So maybe things happen because things get things wrong, and it's quite hard to do a science, to predict misperceptions. So I think it will be a hard job to make precise point predictions. And as for the Arab uprisings as such, there's been predictions about how these authoritarian rules could not last any longer for the last 30 years. Nothing happened. And that was the reason why a lot of us began to study how come they didn't change when they ought to, so to speak.
Yeah, let me just quickly link up to two of the questions to allow for more debate as well. First, in terms of the US and regional autonomy, I think it's a very interesting question. Definitely, we are seeing that, as we all know, the US is retreating from the region. This is part of the Obama very conscious politics. It's not because they're really forced to, but it's a conscious choice. And as you mentioned, they very consciously have adopted a much more pragmatist and realist approach to the Middle East. So when talking about regional autonomy, I think it's going to be very interesting to see that when we do get a new president in the White House, and if he's a Republican, and if he would like to be more activist in terms of the Middle East, what will then happen? Will the US then really have lost its former power? Will we still see these kind of patterns of regional autonomy? I think that's going to be interesting to see. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly about how we are to understand the Arab uprisings, which I should note is not my field at all. But I think that perhaps it could be interesting really to analyze this as a kind of site for political struggles. So there are various groups and various individuals, they each have their idea of what was the uprising all about. So some would say that it's really about the economy, it was really about decency, it was really about political rights, it was really about Islamism, it was really about a generational gap, youth, etc. So each group and each political actors, they had their own version of what was the Arab uprisings all about. So I would perhaps say it's a little bit like your analogies, Morten, that you can pick and choose between these different claims.
Thank you very much for your talks, which were really fascinating and useful. I'd like to make a suggestion for particularly the historical analogies approach, which I find really interesting and important. And in fact, in almost every one of those dates that you gave and those periods, there is something that we can see as analogous with what's going on today. I would add to it the South African and American civil rights struggles in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. But the point I think that is important is that what is happening in the Arab world, seen from within the Arab world, is really about the process that has, the single important process that has never happened in this period, ever in history, not just in modern history, which is national self-determination anchored in citizen sovereignty. We've never had Arab citizens write their own constitutions, define their borders, shape their relations, clarify their values, hold power accountable, and enjoy the benefits of citizenship. So this isn't only about political values of a government or of a state or a weak state or a strong state. It's about statehood itself. The process, so this is really, this is unprecedented in that it is about the birth of Arab statehood, defined by its own citizens, which has never happened before. And so when you look at the constitutional debates in Tunisia, Egypt, especially in Tunisia, now we're going to see them in Yemen and in Libya and other places, they're tackling the most fundamental issues of identity, of power, accountability, dignity, values, borders, everything. Arabism, Israel, Islam, religion, minorities, etc. So I think we need a slightly different approach than looking so much at states or political orders, but it's the validity, it's the fundamental legitimacy of these states that has never been defined or validated by the people of these states. And so this is totally unprecedented. It's never happened before. And I don't think it's ever happened before on a whole regional basis where people all over the region are making similar claims. But I would argue that every country in the Arab world, including the Gulf and Jordan and Morocco and Sudan, every country in the Arab world, to very different degrees, you have citizens articulating similar grievances. And they're about statehood, they're about citizenship, they're about self-determination. And the ultimate prize is sovereignty, to have sovereign countries, where the policies of these states are formed by the citizens through a process of government that they define. So, and the last point I'd make simply is, maybe there's an interesting analogy with 1849 in Denmark and the beginning of the Danish process of a peaceful transition from an autocratic monarchy to a democracy, but it took you about 100 years. So we might do some interesting comparative issues there.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on some of these ideas in terms of thinking about how to think about regional order and how to bring in a different set of factors, including issues from society. But one sort of, say, analytical or sort of framing way might be the thinking that to stop focusing on the uprisings themselves is a period that obviously that changes, but maybe in the longer run, there's other processes going on that are, in the big picture, like the most important factors. And one would be this idea of the decline, the retreat of the U.S. Thinking not so much as an Obama administration policy, but as we finally have a moment that's period in the post-Cold War when the U.S. no longer has a regional strategy or vision. The early post-Cold War, vision and ideas, dual containment, peace process have really sort of collapsed and declined and are no longer the agenda driving what the U.S. wants to see. So it's not clear what the U.S. wants to see in the region. How vital is it to its security? And so now we have a period where there's not the Cold War defining its security interests. So that's one thing that I think could be going on in defining the regional order, not so much just Obama's choice to different policy. The other thing relates to the socioeconomic and societal, and just thinking in terms of the shift from populist to neoliberal economic policies within each of these countries has created across their societies a whole different set of, let's say, insecurities for populations. And I think this is related to this issue of self-determination. Have these states served their populations in the forms of identity as well as in the forms of well-being and so forth? So that challenge is also something that's part of a much longer-term sort of cycle. And there were earlier issues in the 50s where states did try to promote these strategies that were incorporated, they were politically inclusive and so forth. And there's been a sort of retreat from that. And so this kind of sets up a whole nother challenge for these states that are dealing with an order. So trying to mobilize their just legitimacy or control, or where are their sources of insecurity, how much of it's other powers and how much of it's governing society, the critical challenge.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for raising these questions, and this gives me an opportunity again to think a little about this. I think it's important that we keep in mind what are we trying to explain, what is our object here, and what I tried to do at least was not to explain the Arab uprisings at all. But instead to look at what are the changes in the international politics of the region. And now I very consciously use the word international politics of the region because I can hear from your comments that the very term order is not a very enlightening term. It doesn't help you get what I'm trying to go at. So perhaps we shouldn't use the order as a framework, because you can hear from many of your comments that the connotations you kind of make are to political order, to the order internally or domestically in the states themselves, whereas this is really on a regional level. And so in terms of the US, I think you're very right in pointing out this is not only about the Obama policies. What is interesting is, of course, the kind of more global changes we see and how they impact on the region. And so I think you could perhaps frame this also in terms of overlay or not overlay. So we would, during the Cold War, of course, we would have a kind of overlay by the superpowers, which was then gradually withdrawn from the 90s and onwards. But still, I would like to stick a little to Obama policies in the sense that that's why I posed the question, what will happen if we get like a really hawkish Republican in the White House? Because if it would be a new type, a la the Bush, would the US, it would be kind of a test, would the US then actually be able to come back in the same way in the region? Or is this a more kind of permanent or structural feature of what's going on between regions and the global level? And that's why I posted in this way, because I think it's interesting, because it could be kind of a test of that. And yeah, so having said this about political order, so please, if you have like good concepts we could use instead of regional order that would sort of point the associations in the right kind of direction. I'm very open to your suggestions.
Thanks for bringing the issue of citizenship into the debate. I'm going to a conference in 2 weeks actually on citizenship in the Arab world. So, and actually the framework of that conference is exactly something what you are hinting at, based on Maya Budenschön's notion that actually what is the link between state and society is actually citizenship. It could be used as an analytical concept, and it can also highlight what has been referred to today more, that the Arab uprising is not only about political rights, but also social, economic rights. So citizenship, when it comes to rights, there are political rights, but there are other kinds of rights as well. And also the whole notion about citizenship also refers to the debate about who are we, the community, and legitimacy. And all these are actually classic debates, I would say, from which has been debated in the 50s, 60s, when we had a political science which had a broader agenda, where some of those issues were debated very much. So there's this famous article by Rostow from 1970, where he argues that in order to people to be able to decide in democratic terms, they have to first to decide on who the people are. So you have to figure out who are we actually, as a starting point, and that's also an important question, also in relation to citizenship. So thank you for bringing that issue to our attention.
The analogy to Denmark in 1849. I think, of course, always is interesting and welcomed. I think it is important to bear in mind that the state was very well functioning during the autocratic regime in Denmark. I think the state building and the institution of the states that were built up during the ruling of the king is actually in many ways the same institutions we have today in Denmark. So they worked. So the point was for a little group of elitarian politicians and a mad king to deliver some sovereignty to a small group, and from there it could develop. So it was a very controlled process, so to say, and you are perfectly right. It took 100 years before we came to the people's democracy. But I was wondering, and that might be a bit provocative, but I was wondering where this analogy would lead us in the Arab Middle East. And in a way, I think the very, very controlled processes of opening up in areas of the Arab Gulf states, maybe. But I'm not sure about it, but that could be something we could look into.
Well, just to close, I'd like to thank everybody at IFI for organizing this, and to the three panelists for three excellent presentations and a very interesting discussion with everybody. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in the rest of the inauguration events. Thank you.